In the summer of 1940, as Europe burned and the swastika rose over conquered capitals, one island stood alone. Britain, bloodied, cornered but unbroken. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler watched through reports and maps as the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht had crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in less than a year. Every gamble he had taken had paid off. The world, it seemed, was his to command. Only Britain remained, a stubborn obstacle to the complete domination of Europe. Yet Hitler had not originally intended to invade. He admired the British Empire in a strange, almost romantic way, seeing it as a natural ally of Germany's racial destiny. But Churchill's defiance changed everything. In speeches that crackled through the airwaves, the British Prime Minister made it clear, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender." To Hitler, this was insolence. To his generals, it was a problem. And from that problem was born one of the most audacious yet ill-fated military plans in history, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. In July 1940, the Führer issued Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for the landing operation against England. The plan was ambitious: to cross the English Channel, establish beachheads along the southern coast, capture key ports like Dover and Folkestone, and march on London. But there was a catch. Germany had no navy strong enough to protect an invasion fleet. The Kriegsmarine, still reeling from losses in Norway, had only a handful of major warships. Admiral Erich Raeder himself warned that without air superiority, any invasion would be suicide. Hitler, ever confident, believed the Luftwaffe could solve that problem. He turned to Hermann Göring, the self-assured commander of Germany's air force, whose bombers and fighters had humbled the skies of Europe. The plan was clear. Before the invasion, Britain's Royal Air Force had to be annihilated. Then, with German planes ruling the skies, the invasion barges could cross unopposed. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the British government knew an invasion was coming. The beaches were fortified, the Home Guard mobilized, and secret defensive lines, the so-called stop lines, were prepared across the countryside. In London, Churchill refused to flinch. His advisors pleaded for peace, some arguing that Germany's dominance was inevitable. But Churchill's answer was unwavering. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender." The British people braced themselves. Posters urged civilians to dig trenches and prepare for bombing raids. School children were evacuated from cities. In the countryside, church bells were silenced, to be rung only if the Germans invaded. Britain's defenses were weak, its army still recovering from Dunkirk, but its spirit was iron. Back in Germany, planning for Sea Lion accelerated. The invasion would involve over 160,000 troops, 4,000 landing craft, and hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. The Wehrmacht began amassing barges in the Channel ports, converting river vessels and cargo ships into makeshift landing transports. Maps were drawn, tide charts analyzed, and code names assigned. The first wave would land on a 200-mile front between Ramsgate and Lyme Regis. But the generals were uneasy. The Channel was treacherous, its tides unpredictable. The British Navy still vastly outnumbered the German fleet. And worst of all, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy unlike any before, the Royal Air Force, fighting for its homeland. By August 1940, the skies over southern England erupted in the Battle of Britain, the prelude to invasion. German bombers streamed across the Channel daily, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters, seeking to destroy radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. But the RAF fought back with relentless ferocity. Pilots, many barely out of training, scrambled from grass airstrips in their Spitfires and Hurricanes to intercept the waves of incoming bombers. The odds were stacked against them. Germany had more planes, more experience, and momentum. But Britain had radar, a revolutionary technology that gave early warning of attacks, and the resolve of a nation standing alone. The Luftwaffe believed the RAF would collapse in weeks, but by late August, German losses were mounting. British pilots, guided by the calm voice of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, began to turn the tide. As Goering grew frustrated, his strategy shifted. Instead of continuing to target airfields, he ordered attacks on London itself, believing terror bombing would break British morale. It was a critical mistake. The RAF, freed from defending scattered airfields, could regroup and strike back. The Luftwaffe's dream of air superiority began to crumble. In the war rooms of Berlin, tensions flared. Admiral Raeder reminded Hitler that without control of the air, the Channel crossing was impossible. Generals warned about Britain's naval might and the risk of disaster. But Hitler hesitated to cancel the invasion outright. He kept Sea Lion alive as both a threat and a bargaining chip, hoping Churchill might still seek peace. But Churchill never did. In fact, the failure of the Luftwaffe only strengthened his resolve. Britain had survived the onslaught. Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely, turning his attention instead towards the east, towards the Soviet Union. And so Operation Sea Lion, the invasion that could have rewritten history, was shelved. The barges rusted in their harbors, the troops redeployed, and the plan faded into the shadows of what might have been. Because in 1940, the fate of the world truly hung by a thread. And that thread was the English Channel.
By late September 1940, the dream of invasion was slipping away from Hitler's grasp. To the German public, the promise of striking at the heart of the British Empire had filled the air with pride and inevitability. Propaganda posters depicted gray columns of Wehrmacht troops marching through London's streets, their boots echoing down the Mall as Big Ben stood silent in the smoke. But inside the Führer's headquarters at the Berghof, reality was beginning to intrude. Operation Sea Lion had demanded unity of air, land, and sea, something the German war machine had never truly mastered. The stunning victories in Poland and France had relied on blitzkrieg, fast-moving tanks, motorized infantry, and air support on solid ground. The sea, however, was a realm alien to German strategy. It required coordination, patience, and above all, control of the skies. None of those conditions would exist by the end of 1940. Hitler's confidence in the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Goering's promises of quick victory over the RAF had turned to excuses. Every report from the Channel told the same story. German aircraft were being met by increasingly well-coordinated British defenses. In Berlin, maps were updated daily showing the positions of destroyed radar masts or bombed airfields. But even the most optimistic charts could not disguise the truth. The British were adapting faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Inside Britain, the story was one of resilience and ingenuity. The island had become a fortress of resourcefulness. Along the coastline, villagers woke at dawn to the sound of distant engines and sirens, scanning the horizon for the silhouettes of bombers. Firefighters and volunteers manned watchtowers, while soldiers stood behind barbed wire and anti-tank obstacles. Every night, blackout curtains turned towns into ghostly silence, while searchlights swept the skies like slow, desperate prayers. But beyond the courage of its civilians, Britain's greatest weapon was information. The intelligence war, the unseen front of Operation Sea Lion, was waged not in trenches or skies, but in shadows. At Bletchley Park, a secluded estate north of London, mathematicians and linguists worked feverishly to break the German Enigma code. Each message decrypted there was another small crack in the armor of German secrecy. British analysts soon discovered something extraordinary. They could read many of the Luftwaffe's operational orders. This meant that radar stations and fighter squadrons could be repositioned hours before a raid even began. Goering's air fleets, thinking themselves invisible, were walking into carefully prepared traps. This invisible edge turned the tide more decisively than any dogfight. The Battle of Britain was not only fought in the air, but also in the cipher rooms of Bletchley Park. Meanwhile, Hitler's generals were growing restless. The invasion had been delayed again and again. First for weather, then for logistics, then because the Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority. Every postponement meant more barges lost to storms and air raids, more soldiers growing weary in their coastal camps. In Calais and Boulogne, entire divisions sat idle rehearsing amphibious landings that would never come. Soldiers of the 16th Army wrote home describing endless drills and boredom. They called themselves Kanalratten, channel rats, living in tents and half-sunk boats surrounded by rusting equipment. Some began to suspect that Sea Lion was nothing more than a bluff. They were partly right. In Berlin, Hitler was already shifting his gaze eastward. Plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, were quietly taking shape. Yet he refused to abandon Sea Lion outright. To withdraw officially would mean admitting failure, and Hitler never admitted failure. So the charade continued. Raiders Kriegsmarine maintained the illusion of readiness, though every officer knew the truth. Even if the invasion were launched, it would be a massacre. The Royal Navy, still the largest in the world, could mobilize faster than any German ship could cross. Without the Luftwaffe's protection, the invasion barges, many little more than converted river craft, would be easy prey for destroyers and torpedo boats. In London, British intelligence began to realize that the German invasion threat was fading. Reports from the continent showed declining barge movements, reduced reconnaissance flights, and a new focus on Eastern Europe. But Churchill refused to relax. He knew Hitler was unpredictable, a gambler capable of striking when least expected. He ordered the Home Guard to remain on alert, the coastal defenses to be reinforced, and the RAF to maintain its relentless patrols. Even as the immediate danger ebbed, Britain continued to prepare for the worst. The Deception Division, a secret branch of British intelligence, began experimenting with tactics that would later define Allied strategy: camouflage, misinformation, and psychological operations. Wooden tanks were built to mislead German reconnaissance. Inflatable aircraft lined airfields that did not exist. Fake radio transmissions created phantom divisions. Ironically, these early British deception efforts, born from fear of Sea Lion, would later evolve into the masterstroke of Operation Fortitude, the D-Day deception plan that fooled Germany in 1944. In this way, the invasion that never happened still shaped the one that did. But in late 1940, deception was still about survival. They needed Hitler to believe invasion was possible, that they remained vulnerable enough to keep his attention westward. Every day he delayed turning east bought time, for rearmament, for American aid, and for the awakening of Allied coordination. Inside Germany, dissent began to stir quietly within the military. Senior officers, particularly in the Navy, were bitterly critical of the Sea Lion debacle. Admiral Raeder warned repeatedly that the resources wasted on the invasion buildup could have strengthened the U-boat fleet, which might have choked Britain through a blockade. The furious obsession with spectacle, with grand, symbolic gestures like invasion, had distracted from the quiet, deadly efficiency of submarine warfare. Indeed, by the end of 1940, it was the Battle of the Atlantic, not the Battle of Britain, that threatened to decide the war. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, sinking merchant convoys faster than Britain could replace them. Each sinking was a reminder that Hitler's naval power might be better used in stealth than in storming beaches. Meanwhile, life under the Blitz tested the British spirit to its limits. Night after night, German bombers pondered cities: London, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham. Entire neighborhoods vanished under firestorms. But even amid the destruction, there was defiance. Firefighters worked through infernos, milkmen delivered bottles among rubble, and Londoners slept in underground stations as though in dormitories. The sense of collective endurance was palpable. Churchill visited bomb districts often, walking among the ruins, his cigar clenched tightly as citizens cheered. To them, he symbolized resistance, the unyielding face of a nation refusing to bow. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Those few, of course, were the RAF pilots who had kept the skies clear enough for Britain to survive. By the end of 1940, Hitler's rage towards Britain hardened into contempt. He no longer saw the island as a threat, but as an annoyance, a stubborn, defiant obstacle that refused to understand its place. He told his generals that Britain would fall once the Soviet Union was crushed. Then, he declared, the last hope of the plutocrats will vanish. The invasion fleet was quietly dismantled in the winter of 1940-41. Barges were returned to commerce or scrapped, soldiers redeployed to new fronts. Operation Sea Lion, once touted as the decisive blow of the century, was buried under new plans, new enemies, new ambitions. But its lessons endured. For Britain, it was proof that courage and innovation could offset overwhelming odds. For Germany, It was the first sign that Hitler's strategic vision, so dazzling in conquest, was fundamentally flawed. As 1941 dawned, Europe stood divided, not by occupation lines, but by belief. The Nazis believed in destiny. The British believed in survival. And while Hitler prepared to unleash his armies eastward into Russia, the shadow of Sea Lion lingered, a reminder of what might have been and of the narrow margin by which freedom had survived.
When the autumn rains came to northern France in late 1940, the dream of invasion quietly died. The harbors that once bustled with preparation for Unternehmen Seeloe, Operation Sea Lion, became silent. Barges rusted against the docks, their hulls half flooded, their cargo of helmets and rifles stacked uselessly in warehouses. Soldiers who had once trained for amphibious assault were sent inland, to new postings, new wars. Yet the ghost of the invasion lingered, not in the surf of the English Channel, but in the minds of those who had lived beneath its shadow. In Berlin, Hitler began to rewrite the story almost immediately. He framed the delay of Sea Lion not as defeat, but as strategic postponement, the calculated patience of a leader waiting for the right moment. His speeches spoke of Britain as already beaten, a sitting duck awaiting final collapse. Yet privately he was furious. The Luftwaffe had failed him, the Kriegsmarine had failed him, and, perhaps most intolerably, his vision of total domination had been mocked by an island that refused to kneel. The myth of invincibility, the core of Nazi propaganda, had been fractured. For the first time since 1939, Hitler had announced a campaign that he could not execute. Even his closest generals began to wonder, if the Führer's plans could fail here, might they fail again? The Wehrmacht's High Command, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, conducted extensive after-action studies through the winter of 1940-41. These analyses were not public, but they painted a grim picture. The logistical requirements for invasion had been underestimated by a factor of at least 3. German barge fleets were slow, unstable, and incapable of navigating the Channel's unpredictable tides. The Royal Navy's superiority at sea was overwhelming. Even if the Luftwaffe had won air control, the ground forces could not have sustained supply lines. In one internal memorandum, Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, wrote bluntly, "An invasion of England cannot succeed unless Britain's fleet is destroyed or rendered powerless. We are nowhere near such a position." He knew what Hitler did not want to admit, that the Reich's naval strategy had been fundamentally backward. Germany had built a fleet for coastal defense and commerce raiding, not amphibious warfare. The contrast with Britain's centuries of naval tradition could not have been greater. While Hitler raged and the Wehrmacht reorganized, Britain was transforming. The failed invasion attempt gave the island a surge of confidence. It was not mere propaganda, it was a genuine psychological shift. For the first time, the British people began to believe that Hitler could be stopped. The Blitz still raged, cities burned, but under the destruction was a growing sense that endurance itself was victory. "We can take it," Londoners would say, emerging from bomb shelters as dawn broke over the ruins. The spirit of resistance was no longer abstract. It was lived, night after night, raid after raid. This resilience gave Prime Minister Churchill a new kind of political power. Before the summer of 1940, his leadership was precarious, supported mainly by his eloquence and defiance. After the Battle of Britain and the collapse of Sea Lion, he became untouchable. He had embodied the very survival of the island. Britain now had a leader and a legend, and both would shape the coming years of war. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the failed invasion profoundly altered American strategy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had watched the Battle of Britain with both hope and anxiety. The United States, still officially neutral, had been reluctant to enter another European war, but the sight of Britain standing alone against Nazi power stirred both sympathy and strategic concern. Roosevelt reasoned that if Britain fell, America would face a Europe dominated entirely by fascism, stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. Operation Sea Lion's failure gave him breathing room. It allowed him to push through policies like Lend-Lease, sending vital supplies, ships, aircraft, food, and ammunition to Britain without direct military involvement. It was a masterstroke of political timing, helping the Allies survive without yet committing American troops. Thus, paradoxically, the invasion that never happened became one of the main reasons the United States could later enter the war under far more favorable circumstances. In Germany, frustration turned outward. The idea of striking westward was abandoned, and Hitler's attention shifted decisively towards the east. He became obsessed with what he called the continental solution. In his mind, Britain was no longer a prize worth pursuing. The real future of the Reich was living space in the vast plains of Russia. This transition from west to east marked one of the most critical turning points of the entire war. The failure of Sea Lion did not merely spare Britain, it redirected the entire trajectory of the conflict. Without an invasion in 1940, the Wehrmacht would soon be marching not on London, but on Moscow. Yet not all of Hitler's generals supported this pivot. Admiral Raeder and the Kriegsmarine argued vehemently that the war at sea, particularly against British shipping, was still the key to victory. Instead of a massive land campaign in the east, they proposed doubling down on the U-boat war, strangling Britain's supply lines. Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, pressed the point repeatedly. The Atlantic is where the war will be decided. Britain will die not by invasion, but by starvation. But Hitler was impatient. The Battle of the Atlantic would be slow, invisible, and uncertain. He wanted spectacle, vast armies, rapid conquest, maps changing overnight. The Luftwaffe's failure in 1940 had wounded his pride, and Barbarossa offered redemption. In his mind, the defeat of the Soviet Union would isolate Britain completely and force it to sue peace. It was, of course, a catastrophic miscalculation. As spring turned to summer in 1941, German troops poured eastward. The barges once intended for the Channel crossing were forgotten, their steel melted down or repurposed for other fronts. The resources that could have bolstered Germany's naval and air strength were instead consumed by the endless appetite of the Eastern Front. Historians have often wondered, what if Sea Lion had actually happened? Could it have succeeded under any circumstances? The consensus among military scholars remains almost universally negative. Even in the most optimistic scenario, with total Luftwaffe air superiority and partial naval control, the invasion would likely have been a logistical nightmare. Crossing the Channel with slow, flat-bottomed barges under the threat of British destroyers would have been suicide. The German army, formidable on land, would have found itself stranded without supplies within days. The most likely outcome, as one British intelligence assessment later noted, would have been a second Dunkirk, only with the sides reversed. German troops might have made it ashore in southern England, but they would have been cut off, surrounded, and annihilated before reinforcements could arrive. The irony is that Operation Sea Lion's very impossibility became part of its legend. For decades after the war, it remained a subject of fascination, a what-if that haunted both sides of history. To the British, it was proof of their island's defiant resilience. To the Germans, it symbolized the limits of their reach. Yet Sea Lion left more than myths behind. It reshaped the psychology of warfare. The lessons learned from its planning, both successes and failures, influenced operations on every side thereafter. The Allies, for example, studied the German invasion blueprints intensely. When they planned their own amphibious assault in 1944, the Normandy landings, they drew on many of the same logistical challenges that had stymied the Germans. The British obsession with tides, weather, and transport craft during D-Day had its roots in their analysis of why Sea Lion could never have worked. In a strange way, Hitler's unlaunched invasion became a teacher to the very forces that would one day destroy him. Meanwhile, for ordinary people across Europe, the legacy of Sea Lion was simpler but no less profound. For those who lived through the Blitz, the knowledge that the invasion never came was a quiet triumph. Britain's continued existence as a free nation became a symbol to occupied countries, proof that Nazi domination was not inevitable. The resistance movements in France, Poland, Norway, and beyond all drew moral strength from Britain's survival. In the long arc of history, the shadow of Sea Lion stretched far beyond 1940. It became a symbol of the thin margins upon which fate turns. Had weather, planning, or command decisions shifted slightly, the fall of France in June 1940 changed everything for Germany. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, Britain stood truly alone against a continental power that seemed unstoppable. On paper, Operation Sea Lion looked feasible. The Wehrmacht had proved itself unmatched on land. The Luftwaffe was feared across Europe, and the Kriegsmarine, though battered, still controlled enough coastal waters to think invasion was possible. Yet, what followed revealed not just the limits of Germany's power, but the sheer will and ingenuity of Britain's defense.